South Africa keeps showing up in extremist spaces online, not by accident and not without consequences. Today, we're going to unpack how that happens and what we can actually do to push back.
Spilling the tea, essay, light on the way. Spilling the tea, essay, truth won't fade away.
Welcome to Spilling the Tea SA. I'm your host, Bianca. In this episode, we are covering a lot. We're going to look at how South African narratives travel from social media into global extremist networks and into places you might not expect, like dating websites. We're also going to talk about what happens when these ideas escalate, and importantly, what can we do about it without amplifying harm or feeding the outrage machine. So grab your tea, take some notes if you need to, because this isn't a quick scroll. It's a deep dive, and we need to change how these stories are handled. Let's start at the beginning. In the first week of January 2026, something unusual happened. 3 connected websites, White Date, White Child, and White Deal, were taken offline at the same time. Not quietly, not through a court order or a press release, but live on stage at a major hacker conference in Germany. That moment forced a lot of people to look more closely at what these platforms actually were and what they were quietly doing. So before we talk about how they were taken down, we need to understand why they mattered in the first place. Because White Date wasn't just a fringe website you could ignore. It was designed to feel normal, personal, almost boring. And that's exactly what made it effective. At first glance, White Date looked ordinary. Dating profiles, people talking about nature, tradition, family, and values. Nothing about it looked violent or extreme, and that's exactly why it worked. White Date wasn't alone. It was a part of a small connected ecosystem. So you had White Date focused on relationships and attraction. Then you had White Child focused on children, reproduction, and continuing the race. And then you had White Deal focused on business networking and mutual support. Together, these sites didn't just host opinions, they built a way of life. So love became political, family became ideological. Having children wasn't framed as a choice, it was framed as a responsibility. So once ideology moves into everyday life, it becomes much harder to challenge. This is why how these sites were taken down matters. At the Congress, Martha Root took to the stage. Her talk was called The Heartbreak Machine, Nazis in the Echo Chamber. She walked out dressed as a pink Power Ranger, and this was done deliberately. It wasn't just a joke. Extremist movements rely on seriousness, on myth, on the idea that they are powerful and inevitable. Being dismantled by someone dressed as a pink Power Ranger strips away their authority. But before anything was taken down, something important happened first. For months before the takedown, Martha Root didn't argue with users. She listened. She used AI chatbots. So these extremists were actually having conversations with chatbots. And what she did is she created believable profiles, held long conversations, and let users talk freely about their fear, their identity, gender roles, and politics. The bots didn't push back, and that revealed something crucial. The same phrases kept appearing, the same fears, the same conclusions. People believed they were expressing personal, unique views. But in reality, they were repeating the shared narratives reinforced by the platform itself. Once those patterns were clear, the next step became unavoidable. Alongside observing the conversations, Root identified serious security flaws. So what she did is she accessed the back-end systems, mapped how the sites were connected, and then safely extracted the data. Then during the presentation, live on stage, she deleted the production databases. In real time, what date went offline, what child went offline, what deal went offline, 3 interconnected neo-Nazi and extremist platforms gone. The investigation showed these sites weren't random community spaces. So they didn't just pop up organically and grow. They were traced back to a single operator based in Germany. And that matters because it means these weren't accidents. They weren't free speech platforms. They were designed systems built intentionally to normalize and spread a specific worldview, which raises an obvious question. What happened to the data? The data wasn't destroyed. It was archived for journalists and academics to do research. So there were no tools released to contact users, no encouragement to expose the individuals. And the goal wasn't to punish people with those particular worldviews. It was actually there to understand patterns and to be able to recognize these patterns. And once you start looking at those patterns, one country keeps appearing. Anyone want to take a guess? South Africans were active on these platforms. That matters because in global rights spaces, South Africa plays a very specific role. It's framed as a warning from the future, proof of demographic collapse, and evidence of white victimhood. Often by people who have never even lived in South Africa or even been here. South Africa becomes a symbol, not a society. And those narratives don't stay on fringe websites, they travel. So dating sites like White Date are soft entry points. They feel personal, safe, normal. But once people are inside these belief systems, they often move to harder spaces. So places where violence is no longer just implied, but encouraged. And one of those spaces is Telegram. Now, Telegram isn't one group, it's a network of neo-Nazi Telegram channels that openly promote violence. It has been designated as a terrorist organization in multiple countries because of its role in glorifying attacks and encouraging mass violence. And South Africa appears here too. Investigations found that one of Telegram's prominent online figures was South African from the Western Cape. And that matters because it shows that South Africans aren't just being talked about, they're sometimes active participants and leaders in global extremist networks. And sometimes those ideas leave the internet. And we must keep in mind these online pipelines aren't theoretical. For instance, earlier this year, a South African man living in Australia was identified at a neo-Nazi rally outside a state parliament. The rally was organized by a known extremist group. After this rally, Australian authorities revoked the man's visa. He was detained and deported back to South Africa. Different country, same ideology, same online pathways. And some of these pathways stay in plain sight. It brings us to a very South African example. In a detailed investigation, News 24 identified the person behind the far-right online persona known as Twatterbaas. What looked like an anonymous, aggressive, racist account was linked to a real individual operating in South Africa. But identification alone doesn't explain the impact. So let's look at what you're seeing on the screen right now. What you're looking at is a network of accounts that interacted most frequently with Twatterbaas. Replies, reposts, quote posts, and coordinated pile-ons. And here's the key point. These are South African accounts mainly, not random international users, not bots from nowhere, South African profiles repeatedly and consistently doing the same thing. You'll notice the pattern. They reply within minutes, they repeat the same language, they swarm journalists and critics, they attack dissenters as traitors, communists, or enemies. And by the way, I know a number of these accounts. This isn't spontaneous outrage, it's reinforcement. These accounts serve three functions. First, amplification. They boost posts so fringe ideas appear popular. Second, enforcement. They intimidate critics until disagreement feels risky. And third, legitimization. By presenting as local South African voices, they make these narratives look authentic and grounded. Algorithms see this activity and read it as relevance. That's how these claims are spread. That's how they end up amplified, even receiving engagement from high profile figures like Elon Musk. No one needed to invent disinformation. They just needed to make it loud. And once these stories are loud enough, they travel further than their origins. This is why this all matters. In 2011, Anders Breivik carried out a far-right attack in Norway that killed 77 people. Now, after the attack, researchers examined his manifesto to understand where his ideas came from. South Africa appeared again and again in the manifesto. Breivik explicitly said he was a frequent visitor to right-wing South African blogs. He treated South Africa as a case study, a warning to Europe. He relied on these blogs for statistics, images, rhetoric. One blog, specifically often referred to as ilovesa.blogspot, used blood splatter imagery and farmer genocide graphics. Breivik copied, disputed, and inflated claims directly from these sites and used them to justify violence elsewhere. South Africa wasn't mentioned by accident, it was actually used, which brings us back to where these ideas quietly settle. And this is where we return to Whitegate, because these beliefs don't only live in blogs or Telegram channels. They move somewhere quieter into people's personal lives. Before I read these, this is important. These aren't just dating profiles. They are ideological positioning statements. They show how belief is woven into intimacy. So profile 1. A white South African man wanting to live on a farm away from the cities. He wants a feminine partner, not bossy, focused on motherhood and tradition. He says his political views make people uncomfortable and that he wants to lead. Profile 2, a white South African man identifying strongly as an Afrikaner of European descent. He describes the country as corrupt and hostile, rejects Black South Africans, and hates white liberals, and wants a pure white wife. Profile 3, a white South African man defining himself entirely by race and lineage. He rejects interracial relationships and frames marriage and children as a duty to race and faith. Now, if you're South African, none of this is unfamiliar. You've heard versions of it before. Across all three, South Africa is framed as broken or stolen. Fear about the future becomes rules about love. Politics doesn't stop at voting, it enters the home. These men aren't just looking for partners, they're looking for someone to help carry an ideology forward. And that's why platforms like Whitegate matter. This wasn't censorship. No one was arrested for holding opinions. No one was silenced in public debate. What was dismantled was infrastructure, systems designed to quietly normalize and spread extremist ideas. Harm doesn't start with violence, it starts with repetition. So at this point, the obvious question is, what do we do about this? Because if extremism spreads quietly, then pushing back has to be just as intentional and a lot calmer. And here are a few things that genuinely help. So firstly, a lot of harmful stories spread because people quote them, screenshot them, or argue with them directly. Algorithms don't care why you engage. They only care that you did engage. So instead of responding to a false or misleading claim, respond around it. That means don't quote the original post, don't screenshot it, don't tag the accounts that shared it. Instead, create a separate informative post, explain what the data actually shows, what context is missing, what common framing tricks are being used, You're not fighting the claim. You're removing its power by replacing confusion with clarity. And this helps people who are genuinely unsure without boosting the original false narrative. The next thing is slow it down. Extremist narratives rely on urgency, and you will notice it with a lot of these pod bros that get on and they're very aggressive and they speak fast and they don't take a breath, highly emotional. Everything is framed as this is happening everywhere. It's getting worse. It's already too late. Catastrophizing everything. Slowing the story down breaks that spell. So when you hear claims about South Africa being used as proof of collapse, ask simple questions. Compared to what? Over the time period? According to which source? You don't need a debate. You just need to slow the moment down enough for fear to lose momentum. Push back where it actually spreads, and that is in private spaces. A lot of radicalization doesn't happen on big public platforms. It happens in WhatsApp groups, family chats, braais, one-on-one conversations. This is where pushback is most effective. You don't need to win. You don't need to lecture. Simple interruptions matter. So I'm not sure that stat is accurate. That sounds more complicated than that. Where did that claim come from? These moments don't go viral, but they break certainty. And that matters far more. Support journalism, not rumors. Now, I know I personally have been critical of mainstream media. However, every serious part of this story that I'm telling you today, White Date, Telegram, Twitter Boss, Breivik sources, came from investigative journalism. Not influencers, not angry pod bros, not anonymous accounts. So if you want fewer myths about South Africa circulating globally, credible reporting is needed. So where possible, take a look for, I would say, credible journalists that do the legwork, that actually put in the effort to investigate and analyze, and that aren't biased. And when you find that, share that solid reporting, because that does much more damage to the extremist narrative than arguing ever will. Another thing that I think is very important to highlight is most people don't start extreme. Okay, this is very important. Very few people begin with violent ideologies. They begin with fear, with loneliness, loss of control, a sense that the future is shrinking. That's why spaces like White Date are dangerous. They don't radicalize by shouting, they radicalize by making fear feel normal and shared. So, understanding that helps us respond with clarity instead of panic. And then finally, don't let South Africa be turned into a myth, because this really matters. South Africa is often used as a symbol, not a real place, a warning story, a talking point, a justification. Pushing back means refusing to let complex realities be flattened into propaganda. Ask, who is telling the story? What are they leaving out? Who benefits from this framing? Because the most effective pushback isn't outrage, it's context. And you will find this missing in most of our extremists and more far right communicators and commentators. What the story shows us is that radicalization doesn't usually look dramatic at first. It doesn't arrive with uniforms or slogans. It arrives quietly in dating profiles, in blog spots, in group chats, in stories repeated often enough that they start to feel like common sense. That's why takedowns like White Date matter, because they disrupt infrastructure, not opinions. But takedowns alone aren't enough. What happens next depends on how we respond. It depends on whether we refuse to amplify fear-based narratives, slow stories down instead of spreading them, push back calmly in private spaces where beliefs actually form, and insist on context when South Africa is used as a symbol instead of a real place. This isn't about winning arguments online. It's about interrupting certainty, because extremism doesn't grow because it's persuasive. It grows because it's repeated, unchallenged, and made to feel normal. And the most effective response isn't outrage, it's clarity. So when you see these narratives again, and you will, remember that you don't have to repeat them to challenge them. You can explain without amplifying, question without performing, and choose not to pass the story on. That's how these pipelines break. Thank you for spending this time with me on Spilling the TSA. I'm Bianca. Stay curious, stay critical, and always ask who benefits from the story you're being told.
Spilling the TSA, light on the way. Spilling the TSA.